Hello class, this is our lecture on photosynthesis, and to help us understand photosynthesis, we're going to use a tree as a case study. So as many of you might know, a small acorn fruit grows into a giant oak tree. But the question is, where did all this weight come from? How can we go from this tiny little acorn to this huge tree with literally tons of dry biomass, which is to say, woody tissue? Well, first off, let's review where photosynthesis occurs. And the short answer is in any green organ. It's typically the leaf, but it can also be a stem if that stem is green. Even sometimes roots are green, but usually it's the leaves. Inside of the leaf, it's in the cell. In the cell, it's found in the chloroplast, and the chloroplast has thylakoids and stroma. The light reactions of photosynthesis occur in the thylakoid, and the Kelvin cycle occurs in the stroma. Now, lots of different types of energy are emitted from the sun, and it's the ultraviolet light that is the most important for plants, because plants can use this visible light and use it to power this photosynthesis reaction. Chloroplasts contain several pigments. They are not just green. The green pigments are there, but there are other colors as well. So chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B are very important. But then we have the yellow and orange pigments that are called carotenoids. In some photosynthetic organisms, besides the plants, such as the algae, we find another class of pigments called the phycobilins, and these are blue or red. You might have heard the phrase that plants need fresh air, and that is true. Plants do need air in order to be able to do photosynthesis. But how is it that plants can make huge structures from the air? First off, recall the relationship between photosynthesis and respiration in any ecosystem. We have this continual cycle between photosynthesis and respiration in different types of organisms. Sunlight's energy goes in and heat energy comes out. But most importantly, the sugars made from photosynthesis can be broken down by respiration, thus releasing and making ATP, which can be used for cellular work. So how do we get this air in and out of our leaves? Well, the short answer is diffusion. Plants exchange gases through their stomata. So how do plants use air, especially carbon dioxide gas, to actually build this big tree? How can they make wood, roots, bark, all that good stuff that makes up a tree? Well, again, the short answer is photosynthesis. The site of photosynthesis is typically any green part. And again, they're green because they contain lots of chloroplasts. The inputs to photosynthesis include carbon dioxide gas that comes in through the stomata and water that comes in through the roots. Sunlight, as we mentioned previously, is the energy source. The outputs of photosynthesis include sugars and oxygen, and without these sugars and oxygen being produced, nearly all life on Earth would not exist. That is to say, we are dependent upon these organisms that do photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is broken down into two components. We have the light reactions and the Kelvin cycle. And we're going to get to the bottom of these over the course of this lecture. Today's overall learning goals are as follows. Understand the role of carbon dioxide, water, and light. And then for each of the components, which is the light reactions and the Kelvin cycle, make certain you can describe the goal of the reaction, how it happens, and where each reaction occurs in the cell. So how does air, and particularly carbon dioxide, become wood? Well, plants can use this carbon and carbon dioxide to ultimately build structures. And step one to get this process going is the light reactions. Now, the goal of the light reactions is to trap the sun's energy and store it as chemical energy. And what the plant does is it uses sunlight to split water molecules. And we'll see why this is important in just a moment. Now, less than 1% of the water absorbed is actually used during photosynthesis. The rest of it just goes to other places in the cells where it's stored in vacuoles, or it just transpires out of the stomata into the atmosphere. This water is key, however, because water is the main source of electrons during photosynthesis as these energy transformations are happening. Recall the anatomy of a chloroplast. We have thylakoid discs that are organized into stacks that are called the grana. The stroma is the fluid that's found between the grana. Now, as light strikes the chloroplast, and more specifically the pigment molecules found on the thylakoid membranes, the chlorophyll gets excited by that light. It starts vibrating and releasing electrons. These electrons ultimately end up at a reaction center. And the reaction center contains only one pigment, that is chlorophyll A. So therefore, all the other pigments that we've discussed are accessory pigments that act as antennas directing photons to the reaction center. So the light reactions, in essence, is where pigments absorb visible light and they transfer this energy to reaction centers. So which colors does chlorophyll actually use? Well, scientists figured this out by doing quite a simple experiment. So chlorophyll begins to get excited by light and starts vibrating. But what light actually gets the chlorophyll excited? Scientists put a bunch of algae in a petri dish that would photosynthesize when light was present. Once they photosynthesize, they produce oxygen gas. They also put oxygen-loving bacteria in the petri dish and observed where those bacteria flocked to. Well, sure enough, they flocked to either end of the spectrum, to the violet-blue and the orange-red wavelengths of light. Not so much in the middle, where it's green and yellow. This makes sense, because what colors do plants reflect when they are hit by this light? Yellow-green. When we look at a green leaf, most people would see that as the color green. Of course, people see differently, so not everyone sees that green, but a lot of people do. Whatever wavelengths of light they don't absorb, they reflect. So to further break down how the light reactions work, let's take a look at this figure. The figure shows us photons of light that are striking these pigment molecules, and they end up passing all of these electrons to the reaction center. The first reaction center we're going to look at is called the water splitting photosystem. Now, splitting water molecules by using both energy from the sun and an enzyme, those important proteins found in cells, this allows us to actually split the water. And when we split the water, it releases oxygen as a byproduct. So it's kind of interesting how at the very first stage of the light reactions is where all of the oxygen gas comes from. The electrons end up getting transferred to the primary electron receptor and then passed down an electron transport chain. Now, I like to refer to this reaction center as the water splitting photosystem, but it does have a fancy name as well. It's called the P680 photosystem, but I prefer to call it the water splitting photosystem because that is what is occurring there. This number 680 refers to the peak absorption spectrum by this reaction center. As electrons move down the transport chain, they release energy that is used to pump hydrogen ions into the inner membrane. And this is very important because as these hydrogen ions build up on one side of the membrane, they follow the rules of concentration gradients. They move from high concentration to low concentration through a little machine that's used to make ATP. At the same time, we have photons of light that are exciting pigment molecules at the other reaction center, which is called the NADPH producing photosystem. And again, that has a fancy name as well, P700, which refers to the peak absorption spectrum. But I like to refer to this as the NADPH producing photosystem because that is what it produces. As these electrons are transferred along an electron transport chain, the final electron acceptor is the reduction of NADP plus to NADPH. Where does NADP plus come from? It's already found floating around in the grana. So at the end of the light reactions, we have a ton of energy molecules and electron carriers. We have NADPH loaded with electrons, and we have ATP. But notice we still have no wood, no bark, no roots, and we still haven't used carbon dioxide. We're saying that trees are built from the carbon and carbon dioxide, and we haven't even used it yet. Let's see how that happens in our next step, which is the carbon reactions, also called the Calvin cycle. Now, the carbon reactions, or Calvin cycle, it's known by both names, is light independent. That means it happens in the light or the dark. Of course, the light reactions that we just discussed only occurs during the day when there's light around. The goal of the carbon reactions is to take energy from ATP and NADPH and store it in sugars made from carbon dioxide. We're going to finally use carbon dioxide gas that diffuses into the leaves from the air, and we're going to finally build a sugar. This sugar can then be used as a building block as we break down this sugar, use ATP to actually make things such as cell walls. Where does the carbon reactions occur? They occur in the stroma of the chloroplast. And in this extensive figure, I'm going to highlight the key parts. Number one, the first phase of the carbon reaction is carbon dioxide fixation. During carbon dioxide fixation, an enzyme catalyzes a chemical reaction in which a 5-carbon sugar called RUBP and carbon dioxide gas are the reactants, and the products are a 3-carbon compound that will be used in the next step. This carbon dioxide fixation is so amazing because it takes an inorganic molecule, which is carbon dioxide, and makes it usable by life. Phase 2 of the carbon reactions is reduction. And remember, in chemistry, a reduction means a gain of electrons. We're going to be reducing these 3-carbon compounds by electrons that were carried in the NADPH. This is going to result in sugars actually being produced. The final stage is regeneration. This allows us to get back RUBP so that the cycle can indefinitely continue as long as carbon dioxide is available. So regeneration means that we are going to regenerate RUBP so that we don't run out of it in the chloroplast. So today's photosynthesis learning goals should hopefully be clear to you now. Understand the roles of carbon dioxide, water, and light. Well, the carbon in carbon dioxide is used to make sugars. Water gives electrons to a reaction center, and the byproduct is oxygen gas. and light is the energy source. For both the light reactions and the Kelvin cycle, break down the goal, the how, and the where. For the light reactions, the goal is to trap and store the sun's energy. How does it do it? Pigments absorb the light. There are two photosystems and an electron transport chain that get the job done. Where does it occur? On the thylakoids. The Kelvin reaction's goal is to store the energy of ATP and NADPH by making sugars from carbon dioxide gas. How does it occur? In three distinct phases: fixation, reduction, and regeneration. And where does it happen? In the stroma of the chloroplast. I now hope that you can understand that we can take air and actually build a tree. All right, that's it for today's lecture. I hope that you will email me if you have any questions, and thank you very much for listening.